Hello, hello to my True Blue crew. I am just a few minutes late from my publicized 10 a.m. start. I apologize. Scrambling around at the last minute trying to make sure I had everything ready for the topics I planned to discuss. So let's just jump right in. And those of you catching the replay, thank you so much. If you want to join in on the live portion of this event, we share some sewing time on the first Saturday every month at anywhere between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Pacific time. It really varies. It depends on my schedule, but I am an early bird, so I do like to get up and get going. So mark your calendar for October, first Saturday, and I'll see you there. So we're going to spend some time today. I've blocked off 2 hours. So drop in, spend as long as you can. Sew along with my chatter in the background. That would be great. And drop a comment and tell me what your Saturday plans are. Please be sure and leave your name so I can get to know you with those different handles and labels that we use on social media. I'm Andy, and this is True Blue Quilts, a place to enjoy, experiment, and excel as you quilt. And I decided to take on a 30-day challenge for September for free motion quilting practice. And my philosophy is that you need to sketch and then stitch. Your sketching or doodling practice really does translate to easier movements when you move to the sewing machine and try free motion quilting, whether you are quilting on a domestic or quilting on a long arm. The uh, the ideas and the motifs do work well either on either format. So before I dive into today's design, I'll let you grab a sketch pad and pencil for that, or pen. I'm using a whiteboard and marker just because that's reusable and a little bit more environmentally friendly, I suppose. Although the markers do tend to dry out pretty quick. But anyway, whiteboards are my preferred warm up for free motion quilting sketch practice. I was going to share a little bit about my quilting journey. I started quilting when my mom opened a fabric store. She had retired from many years as a nurse and was chatting with a friend, and they decided to take on this crazy adventure. And as a kid, I had never sewn. My mom recognized very early that I didn't have the patience as a younger child, so she just let me pursue other craft activities. I did a lot of handwork with my grandmother, crochet, a little bit of crochet. I really got into cross stitch. So working with fiber, yarn, thread had been part of my life, and I always watched my mom sew clothes and beautiful things. And I have a quilt that she made when I was about, I guess it was 7 or 8 years old. And so, we just, both of us kind of dabbled in different sewing crafts. And then when she opened this fabric store, I live in the same city. So I was working right alongside her for this venture and fell in love with that fabric and just dove in wholeheartedly and started quilting, soon became obsessed, took over the dining room table. And then I wanted to see the project from beginning to end. I didn't like the wait for, to get on the long armor schedule. I did try some free motion quilting on a domestic machine and did, a handful of projects. And after pushing through a twin size quilt on a domestic machine, I said, no, thank you. Let me investigate long arms. And I bought a long arm like my second year of being a quilter. So, and I never looked back. It's been fabulous. And I love, love, love to free motion quilt on my Gamel Classic Plus long arm that I've had for over 15 years. So I do get paid. I take in customer quilts, so I am a professional quilter, but I am not one of these show quilters that does really perfect ruler work and fabulous quilting. I have some basic motifs. We can always improve. So here we go with today's free motion quilting design. We are going to sketch some flames. So let me get back here so you have the most viewing area. And I think my flame stitches are basically an S from the bottom. Can you see that design? So you just take your curve up and then you echo back. And that's your basic flame stitch. If you want to do more of like a candle taper flame, you do a wider bulb up to the top, and if however you want to come to a point. But you can see I tend to, instead of do the mirror image of a bulb flame, I tend to just do that S curve and echo back, and you can make those flames as big and echoed as many times as you want. And that is a really, really fun free motion quilting motif. You can, as with all our free motion quilting designs, we want to practice in all directions. So let's get that flame stitch going. And then out to the side. And you can see that you generally have to do 3 echoes to change directions. So you can see how this would be a great filler all over texture. Work back into this area, and we've filled up the space with some really good texture. The other thing you want to do when you are practicing free motion quilting is to vary the scale of your design. So we can do little flames, medium flames, and really big flames. I'm thinking of the kind of graffiti fire flames that you see kind of on, like, I'm thinking motorcycle or car, art. And they tend to have like curly flames. I didn't do that point very well, but so you can really go all sorts of directions with those flames. So we want to practice moving in all directions. You want to vary the scale as you practice. So those are an example of the flame stitch for free motion quilting. As I said, that can be done. Oh, it reminds me of, I wanted to show you a border design if you wanted to use flames, see how that looks. I showed you the overall, and then if you wanted to do those candlestick flames as a border, you can see how you can travel along a straight line and just fill in the border or sashing however you have that around your quilt, and that would be a lovely motif. So that is our free motion quilting practice for today, flames, that you can put in all sorts of quilts. And I did use that as a filler one time over the entire background of a queen size quilt. And I found it quite a challenge because the fabric was black and I was using black thread. So I don't recommend necessarily doing that, but I do like to match my thread to the fabric that I'm quilting on. So it can be a little bit of a visual challenge, and there's all sorts of tricks of lighting. You know, if you shine a flashlight or something at the surface of your quilt, it creates those shadows that make it easier to see. And sometimes I turn out the lights in the room and just have my sewing machine light on the fabric, and that allows me to see my stitches and where I'm going. And if it's dark fabric and you sew over previous stitching lines, who's going to know, who's going to care? So anyway, that is our free motion sewing or free motion stitching sketch practice for the 3rd day of September. And the next thing I wanted to do was, I've had a box sitting here for a while, and everybody thinks I am like the weirdest person ever because I can literally let packages and presents sit. So go ahead, mail me Christmas presents at the beginning of December. You can rest assured I will wait until Christmas Day. I'm very good at that, delaying gratification. I like the suspense. I like the anticipation. So anyway, this is a box from Island Boutique. I'm an Island Boutique ambassador, and so they send me fabric several times a year, and I have monthly assignments. So you've seen some of those. I'm just opening this latest shipment. Pandemic supply chain issues are affecting the fabric industry quite a bit, and Island Boutique is no exception. So there have been some shipping delays with their new lines of fabric, but this is some of the coordinates and pre-cuts. I'm just reaching over to the trash can. Ooh, first up, some 40 weight thread from Aurifil. And let me get that nice lavender color. Thank you, Aurifil. They're an industry partner for the Ambassador program. Ooh, nice bright red fabric, bright thread from Aurifil. This is their 30 weight. I'm just verifying here in the fine print. Yeah, this is my, because they make it nice and easy to check the weights of the thread. The orange is what I typically buy. That's the 30 weight. A little bit heavier. Lower numbers are heavier, higher numbers are thinner. It's opposite, so you have to think for a minute. And these green tops are the 40 weight. And there's one more, or two more bouncing around in there. Another 40 weight. This is a nice gray. I'm trying to find a place where that color will show up for you. Nice steel gray. Good neutral for piecing. And then, ooh, this is fun. The red, white, or not red. My words today, I'm sorry. Blue and white with a little bit of gray. That's a variegated thread. That will be fun, fun, fun to play with. So thank you to Aurifil. And then we have our dun, 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 pre-cut. These are from their summer 2022 collection, Island Boutique fabric, that is heading to stores right now. And ooh, I'm in love. Look at those colors. This is the Imperial Mums collection. Imperial Mums. And this is their version of a layer cake, 10-inch squares. I love that. Doesn't that just look like a sunset at the beach with those gorgeous colors, and starting off with my favorite blues and teals, and then those nice yellows and oranges, and into those deep purples. Oh, gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. And then they always send coordinates, 2-yard cuts, and they sent me a peach tone that is actually called Shell, and this pretty purple is Regal. So let me find a view that doesn't have stickers on it, but pretty pre-cuts from Island Batik. So that will be fun. I'll have to think of a good project to feature those wonderful fabrics. I always love opening my fabric packages from Island Batik. So those were the treats that I had for you today, and it's time to sew. I thought it would be fun to take a look at some disappearing blocks, because I like classic quilt blocks, and I've got a ton of fabric that I just want to use up in some fun and interesting charity quilts. So I've done a few different projects over these Saturday sew and chats, and I thought it would be fun to experiment with disappearing blocks. Now, the concept of a disappearing block is that you start with a traditional block, and then you make some cuts and rearrange it, and turns into something new and different. So the standard blocks that I am going to use today are the 4-patch. We'll do a disappearing 4-patch. And if you watched my Make It Red video from last week, I was really intrigued by this red fabric that I found in my stash, these scrolls. So I paired it with one of the Island Batik solids that's in a red, and made a classic 4-patch. And then, since I had those colors laying around, actually I found this fun scroll, a little bit different type of scroll, in my stash, and I paired it with a light blue grunge and a solid purple from my Batik stash, and made a 9-patch. So we're going to do 4 patches and 9 patches. And for an extra challenge, I haven't seen this done, but I want to give it a try. I made a churn dash. And isn't that a great fabric combination with that kind of fire engine red and the light blue and that bold purple? Really interesting. So we'll see what happens when we chop up our churn dash block. So that is my sewing project for today. I'm going to start with the 9-patch, because that is actually the easiest one to cut. So I'm going to do that, and then we will play a little bit. So good morning, good morning. We've got a few new faces joining us, so say hi in the chat. This is supposed to be a social event, so I get tired of talking all the time. So please chime in and let me know where you are, what you're working on, and if you have any big plans. It is Labor Day weekend, so I know we all enjoy our labors at the sewing machine, but hopefully you get a chance to enjoy the holiday weekend. And although our first responders, medical teams, I know there's a lot of people that work through what are called holidays for everyone else. So I've got my 9-patch block on my cutting board, and I'm just going to preview what I'm going to do. I am going to cut this block on the midpoint, on the halfway marks of these blue squares. So I started with 5-inch blocks. So now they're probably 4.5. So that means 2.25 is what I'm looking for in down the center of that blue block. And my block's a little bit bigger than my cutting mat, so that is a problem. I was not thinking. I wanted to start with larger pieces. That's why I cut 5-inch squares, because as you cut the blocks and piece them again, you've got those additional seams, and that's taking up fabric. So if you started with something like my favorite 2.5-inch strips, you'd end up with really tiny blocks, and I certainly did not want that. So let me make sure I have enough room there. Yeah, so I'm at 4.5, so I'm going to cut at 2.25. And I could have grabbed my smaller ruler. What size ruler do you guys grab most often? I love to use my 6.5 square. Obviously, I use my long one for cutting yardage, but then I have my 12.5-inch square that just is, it's a good medium size, especially if you are going to classes and you don't know, if you're going to be working on small pieces or your finished blocks that you need to square up or what. So kind of like strip piecing, we started with our 9-patch and I just sliced down that center square. And now we end up with almost like your sashing and your cornerstone for these blocks, but it's a little bit faster. I guess it just changes the the cutting step from doing it all at the beginning to cut these smaller units and sew them all together. But same philosophy as if you do strip sets and then subcut. So I've got now 4 of these identical blocks because here was, the top half of my 9-patch. And now we get to spin them and rearrange. So I'm going to do that. And I've got my El Cheapo design board, which is just a square of leftover batting. And we can start playing with these blocks and spinning these around. And here is a fun look at the disappearing 9-patch layout. So I just made 2 of the large squares kiss, and that meant that you put the opposing corners in different locations. Oh. And then let me turn that corner one more time so that looks a little better. I had this one because I didn't necessarily want those 2 to kiss, so I had that, I think I had it this way. But then if I turn this one, what I'm going to do to make so that the small purple squares march across the top and the bottom of the block in opposite directions, that would be a fun layout as well. So that's really the fun of 9-patch blocks. So I'm just going to reverse the placement of the top and bottom row because I want to see what that effect would look like when you have, instead of the large squares meeting across, so you'll have alternate rows where the big squares are touching and then when the small squares are touching. So that might be a fun effect for a disappearing 9 patch. I don't know that I've seen that arrangement before. So I'm going to go ahead and sew those together. And I'll show you that finished block in that arrangement with the blocks going the different directions. All situated at my sewing machine again. And the nice part about disappearing 9 patch is that since I've got them, the squares going in opposite corners, there's no seams to match. So yay, easy sewing. And then I don't have my half square triangle leader ender things sorted at the moment, so I'm just using a thread tab in between my blocks so that I can kind of continue my chain piecing effect. And I am not going to get up and iron at this point. I'm just going to finger press that block. I need one of those wooden rollers or a Hera marker to keep by my machine and just make that process a little bit easier. But my fingernails do the trick. So I get a nice crisp seam there. And then when you have your 2 patches together, then I do pin because you will have a seam to match for your 4 patch. And I think that is so funny with disappearing blocks that when you make a disappearing 9 patch, it becomes a 4 patch. And when you make a disappearing 4 patch, it becomes a 9 patch. So we'll talk about that. One thing I want to mention when you're matching your seams, I was able to finger press these in opposite directions so that main center seam nests, but now I've got my seams going in the same direction. Not a big deal, but it can be a little tricky to pin those together. So I just get it lined up as best I can, insert my pin on the seam of one side, and then look to the back to make sure I hit the stitching line on the back as well. And then when my pin lays right across the stitches, I know those seams are lined up. So it can be tricky when you've got those bulky seams laying right on top of each other. That's why we try to nest as much as possible, but when you're chopping up blocks in funky ways, it doesn't always work to nest. Ta-da! There is a disappearing 9-patch block. So if you remember, I started with this multicolor print in the corners and the single purple square in the center. And when I cut it in half and rearranged the quadrants, I made sure that the print was in the upper left of one row and the bottom right of another row. And that once I get more of these blocks going across the quilt, we will have alternating rows where you have the two bigger blocks kind of meeting or overlapping, and then a row where the two smaller squares meet. So I think that makes a really interesting look, and you can see how the layout of your 9-patch is going to be really important. You have to think about which squares you want to leave as let me get centered in the camera again. Your corner squares from the 9-patch are not going to be cut. So if you want to do kind of an I Spy look, that's a good place for small prints or big prints, something recognizable that you don't like. You don't want to chop a horse in half necessarily, or a face. So you can put those in the corners of your original 9-patch. And then these sashing pieces, you can just I pulled the coordinating colors. So that little swirl is kind of a light blue. And then I and then the center square, whatever you put in the center of your original 9-patch is going to be the smallest square in the disappearing version. So those are just some tips and one possible layout for a disappearing 9-patch. So that will go in my charity pile, my orphan block pile. I'm going to have to make an orphan block quilt here pretty soon, but I think it will be fun to try all sorts of different disappearing 9-patch layouts. I'll try and stay with this red, blue, purple color scheme, and then make a sampler quilt out of, a disappearing sampler. Won't that be fun? Okay, so putting that aside, and our next, I did all this pre-sewing thinking it would take a long time to cut and sew these next blocks, and I'm just blazing through. Our next one is the 4-patch, and I said this is going to turn into a 9-patch, so let's see how that happens. When I cut a 4-patch for the disappearing version, I'm going to we can't cut it right in half because that's the seam we already sewed. So there's no point in cutting apart on the same exact seam that's already there. So I'm going to cut halfway between each side. So that means that I need to make 2 cuts vertically and 2 cuts horizontally. So this is going to become a much smaller block when you do a disappearing 4-patch, but it creates the illusion of difficult piecing with those small pieces, but you've kind of done the strip piecing method because you started with a bigger unit. So let me cut those blocks in half and take a quick measurement. I should be writing all these things down, but I'm not really bothering. If you came in late, I did an unboxing and I've got these fun new threads from Orfil. So I need to put those away. And then I've got a spinning mat. So that makes it easy when I am doing something like this where I need to make multiple cuts. I don't need to move my fabric around and mess up placements or measurements or anything. I can just spin my mat to the other side or pick it up and turn it around, as the case may be. So I made my first cut, and now I'm going to keep that center seam lined up and reposition those fabrics so they're close together so that I can do this second cut across those pieces. And I'll talk about sizes here in just a second. Let me get everything cut for the disappearing 4-patch. Okay, here's our 4-patch, but we have, whoops, I need to trim that. I told you we were going to end up with a 9-patch. So let's start swapping. Basically, you just not as cool as I expected. It makes a checkerboard because I did halves. That was my mistake. I cut those exactly in half. So I do have, hold one. Okay, boring 4-patch turns into a traditional checkerboard. And I shouldn't say boring, I should say plain and simple, which is fine. Checkerboard quilts look really fun, but you don't need to go to all that hassle of sewing a 4-patch and then cutting on the halfway mark. You want to cut the center narrow. That was, as soon as I did it, I remembered. But I did plan ahead and I cut extra squares. So let me make a new 4-patch. And I'm feeling a pin under my feet, so I wanted to try and find that. I need to get my magnetic wand out and find all those pins that I dropped. That's why you should never sew barefoot, especially on a carpet floor. Thanks for stopping by and spending a little bit of your Saturday with us here at True Blue Quilts. We do a live sew and chat on the first Saturday of each month, typically around 10 a.m. to 12 noon on the first Saturday. So I've got my four patch ready, I'm going to nest those seams and sew that together. Curious how long you've been quilting. Hello, Pamela. Nice to see you, as long as the person watching is the same person that's logged into YouTube. Good to see you here. I sew over my pins, and I always tell beginners to take the pins out as they go, but I'm watching very carefully to make sure the needle hops over that pin, and if it looks like it's going to hit it, because you never want to strike the pin with your sewing machine needle, you'll have metal sparks, and that's not good. But kind of a bad habit I've gotten into of sewing over those pins. Hi, Sheila. Wow. Very experienced quilter in the house. Nice to see you. I've been quilting for, and that's really the only sewing I've done. I've never sewn clothes since 2004. So I am a teacher at heart, so I jump right in, and I like to share what I've learned over the years. I do understand in the quilting world, especially, there are many ways to do things. So I'm just offering the habits I've built up. And if you know a different way, an easier trick, that's great. I love to learn from other people, other quilters as well. So I have my new 4-patch, and we are going to make a disappearing 4-patch that looks more interesting than my first one that I cut, which I cut right on the halfway mark of these squares. All that does is give you smaller symmetrical squares, and we want something more interesting from our 4-patch. Just like our disappearing 9-patch doesn't really look like a 9-patch anymore. So I want to create that same effect. So what I'm going to do is, instead of finding the halfway mark, which is at about 2.5 inches, because I started with 5-inch squares, I'm only going to come an inch away from this center seam. So I'm going to go an inch on the right-hand side, an inch on the left-hand side. So I will have a very narrow strip, and I'm going to do that on both seams. So I'm going to have you could go a 2 1/4 or 1 1/4, which would give you a 2.5 inch piece for that center seam, just because it's going to be a 1/4 inch on each side taken up in the seam allowance. So that's what I mean. This block is going to shrink quite a bit with those extra seams, but we're making 2 cuts on either side of the vertical seam and 2 cuts either side of that horizontal seam. So we are looking at our cutting mat. And like I said, I'll show you this when I finish, because I don't have a fancy dual camera set up here in my sewing. Actually, I'm changing that. I'm going to go 1 1/2 on both sides so that I get a 1 inch strip of fabric that's left. Doing math in public can be a scary thought. Okay, so here's our first version of the cut. And I'll try not to lose any more fabric. So I lined up my ruler 1.5 inches from that center seam. And then I'm going to lay this piece of fabric back the way it was, turn my mat 90 degrees, and make the other cut. And I have to remember I did the 1.5 inches, and now I'm second guessing and thinking I should have done an 1.25 inches again, back to my original thought. But it's one of those kind of improv things. Yeah, Sheila, I can imagine that things have changed quite a bit over the 50 years that you've been quilting. That's amazing, because I have heard in the quilting history kind of aspect of American life that quilting really saw its modern resurgence in the mid 70s because of all the patriotic crafts around the bicentennial celebrations. And the other revolution was the rotary cutter around the same time, early 80s, I guess. So yeah, over those 50 years, I think you've seen so many changes. And then the long arm quilting machines that came on the scene in the mid 90s, I think, is when people started doing that. And the whole kind of divide in the quilting world between machine quilting and hand quilting, and now the machine quilting on a domestic versus machine quilting on a long arm. But there's something for everyone, is what I say. There's so many different things to try in the quilt world that you can try it. And if you like it, great. If you don't, there's plenty other things. And we don't all have to like the same things. So I've got my 4 cuts made. And now this will give us an interesting thing, 9 patch to play with. Like I said, it's really funny with disappearing blocks because the 9 patch turns into 4 patch, and the 4 patch that we started with, we now have 9 patch. And the whole idea of disappearing blocks is just to mix and match once you've got your elements. And we didn't want to do our cuts right in the middle because that just creates a checkerboard. We want to have these center pieces a little bit smaller than these corner blocks so that we can mix and match and make it look more intricate than a basic 4 patch. And now I need to look for my fancy design wall scrap of batting that I played with. So I'm going to start with my center that became a mini 4 patch. And then I'm just going to reverse the pieces. So these pieces that were top and bottom in the center, I'm just going to reverse them in the new version. And our disappearing 4 patch becomes a woven block. I've seen this, I think some places call this a garlic knot, maybe. I'll have to research that. But that's switching the elements of your 4 patch. And I don't think there's really any other cool way to play around with that unless you kept the corners the same as part of their sashing, and then it looks like a weird mess of a thing. So I'm gonna reverse those again and keep my so that you don't have any of the same fabrics touching. And that will be our disappearing 4 patch. So not as many options with the 4 patch because you don't get those 4 quadrants like you did with the 9 patch, because you can spin one quadrant around where you can't really spin anything around in our disappearing 4 patch, because now it's a 9 patch and spinning one row doesn't really do much for that design. So get everything lined up, and this sewing will take a little bit longer, obviously, because we've got 9 pieces to sew together rather than just 4. So an underwhelming disappearing 4 patch. I'm just catching up on the chat, and I am glad you found quilting a help in your, as you deal with health concerns, Pamela. It is a good form of therapy. And I find quilters to be very helpful and generous with their knowledge. So if you are a beginner, just jump in and ask questions, especially here at True Blue Quilts. Happy to answer any questions. Don't think your question is too trivial to bring up. A little more pinning on this because we do have those seams that we want to match. Okay, so I've got rows that are just alternating colors. And as I said, the disappearing 4 patch, you end up sewing it as a 9 patch. So I am just finger pressing to make sure that my seams will nest. And of course I did that one wrong. So for 9 patch construction, it's always sew your rows of 3 blocks and then sew those 3 rows to get your 9 patch. And this is a fun little block because it's just alternating colors. So I'm thinking this would be a fun design to use in all sorts of random rainbow colors, because you're always surprised at how they look when they're chopped up. And again, the benefit of sewing the 4 patch first is that you can get this smaller, 4 patch and sashing rows without having to cut and sew little pieces. It's always easier to sew things together first. and then cut them into smaller pairs. So there is half of our disappearing 4-patch. I have to remember how I was finger pressing. I always want to press out to these larger squares, but in this version you want to press towards that center because we had our center squares pressed out. So I want those to nest, and 2 out of the 3 seams there will nest. So I think that's pretty good average. Catching up on chat. Yeah, isn't it fun, Sheila, to chop things up and mix them all around? That's great. That's the fun of crumb style blocks as well, that you just take different size pieces and sew until you've got a large enough new piece of fabric. Okay, there is our disappearing 4-patch that turns into a woven block or a garlic knot. I've heard that referred to as well when you have these longer pieces and that little 4-patch in the center. So our disappearing blocks. This was a disappearing 9-patch. We started with a 9-patch and then chopped it up and rearranged. Disappearing 4-patch, started with a 4-patch, chopped it up and rearranged. And then the last one that I have prepared, where did it go? Oh, it flew far away. Is a churn dash. So when I started and this is going to work very similarly to our disappearing 9-patch, because a churn dash is a 9-patch. So talking about construction for anyone who hasn't studied a churn dash block before, is that I have my background color, I have a contrasting color for the actual churn dash shape, which is these half square triangles and the smaller strip, and then I chose to use a different color for the center. You could use the background, you could use, whatever. This could be it would give you a little bit different effect if this was the same as the churn dash material. Typically, it's either a 2-color or 3-color block, but that is the classic churn dash. Now, this will be fun to chop up and rearrange because I'm going to make 2 cuts. I'm going to make a cut down the center of each of these strip blocks. And that will give us 4 units to play with and rearrange, much like we did with the disappearing 9 patch. So I just need to measure and find the center of those strip blocks. And again, you want to use a little bit bigger block to start with, or bigger pieces of your churn dash, because you're adding more seams as you chop them up. So you don't want to start too small and then find yourself working in really miniature versions. Okay, so I did that first one at the halfway mark, and here's the second one at the halfway mark. Okay, so here's my churn dash, and you can start to see it slide and fall apart. So you could certainly piece these as individual squares. These are now all the same size little squares, and I've just got a larger half square triangle in the center. But let's play. I'm going to put all of the squares in the same orientation, and we'll see what that looks like. And this is a place where you may want to take a bunch of pictures and see how everything looks. So there is our churn dash as individual quadrants. It looks like a basket quilt, so that would be fun if you made that original center flowers and used, you could just have a lot of fun with that. So that's all in one orientation. Yeah, isn't that fun, Sheila? I'm glad you saw something new and different. Okay, now I'm going to turn the corners so that the alternate sections meet. And this is always a fun look. And I'm trying to do my show and tell nicely. Okay, so this is just bringing your blocks to kiss. So I've got those purple sections, and I think this is the way I'm going to sew it together, with those purple pieces kissing and then the half square triangles kissing. So that just kind of jumbles it all up and makes it really fun. And then what else could we do? We could make them, you could line them up in different directions. So let's see, that's all going one direction. So here's what it looks like if you just had them pointing, the baskets pointing in different directions for the 2 rows. I'd have to see something like this laid out in a bigger sample to see if I really liked that orientation. But that's why I have the EQ8 software, design software, because you can easily drop blocks into a larger quilt and rotate them. And there's even a random button, so you could just put them in all sorts of different configurations and play around with that. So I decided that I was going to have these kiss with the red triangles kissing and the purple squares kissing. So let me get that sewn together. And there's so many variations of classic blocks that are built as 4 or as 9 patches that you can really have fun playing with those classic blocks. Now, how odd, when I match the seams, my blocks don't line up. I wonder why that is. I won't question it. This is just an experiment, so but I definitely want that seam to nest, but I've got extra. Sometimes fabric just acts weird. Oh, it is. Yeah. As I study this block, let me show you what I'm looking at. Right here, this seam on the one side is lower than this seam. I was trying to get that to nest, but I don't think I want it to nest. I need that when I go 1/4 inch in, it'll come to a point, I think. So let me try that without making them nest. That makes that block come together much nicer if you just line those units up and not worry about seams matching. These are going to look just a little bit wrong. We'll see. Yeah. See how that seam doesn't match? It's not right. Oh well. I don't know. Let me finish this other one with the matching and see how that looks. Like I said, and it's an experiment. I lost all my fabric. It disappeared under my sewing machine. My thread tab that I use as my leader ender when I don't have another. I usually keep another scrappy project going so that I can chain piece. Okay, so here was the unit that I sewed together, and I think that looks much nicer with that seam meeting, and I'll just lose that other point is the problem. So like I said, I don't know. I think that's just the nature of this square, that when you cut the center part and not these half square triangles, they're going to get thrown off. So I don't generally worry about being a perfect quilter. So and especially with this as just being a practice, and you know, I spun that 4-patch seam at the back because it was getting pretty bulky. So so I'm gonna leave this one that's the corners don't match as well as this one, just because I want a finished block and I don't want to unpick. But I do need to spin that one. That one doesn't want to spin. When seams don't want to spin, you can always press them open, and that will reduce the bulk. And you end up with some really bulky, icky seams when half square triangles come together. So I press that one open. And then I need to trim that one because that's the side that I am going to sew, and I don't want to have that problem. Okay, so if I pressed one seam open, I should probably press the other seam open. The other thing is you can change your mind halfway down a seam and make it go the other way. Just have a fold somewhere in there. Okay, we want those two to go together. Yeah, there's a lot of not matching seams on this they're just a little bit off. So this is one where you may have to embrace imperfection or end up with a block that's a lot smaller than you anticipated. Because again, I've got these outer red squares that really need to meet, but then I've got all that fullness that I need to stretch in, and I've got almost a 1/4 inch of fabric hanging off the end if I make those seams meet. So we're not going to make those seams meet because that's a nice even block if I sew it just the way it is. So this will be one of those wonky blocks. Pamela's asking about pressing seams, and search the True Blue Quilts channel, YouTube channel, because I do talk about pressing open versus pressing to the dark side. And I do both because I'm a Libra and we always have, typically you can see on this, typically I press to the dark, especially on classic blocks, I press to the dark side as much as possible. Half square triangles, press to the dark side. But there are cases where I press open, like for instance with this block, when I started seeing all that bulk around that half square triangle seam, I pressed open around that. So it kind of depends. I did a postage stamp quilt, which was, kind of like checkerboard, but thousands of pieces. And on that, because I was not organized enough because I was working in small sections to build the whole quilt. It's my Arizona flag quilt, so you can search that on YouTube and get a look at that quilt. I was working in sections, and it would have been really hard to keep track of which row was going to the right and which row was going to the left so they would nest. So I just decided from the beginning to press everything open, and then things are going to match up. You don't have to worry about some seams nesting and laying flat versus others that are really bulky. Some people will argue against pressing open because they think you won't be able to stitch in the ditch when you quilt. I've never had a problem. As I said, I've been long arm quilting for 15 years. I have pressed open and quilted in the ditch on many, many quilts, and I have never had them fall apart. So maybe check back in 100 years. I don't know if the quilting will hold up, but at that point, it's not going to be my problem. So whatever works best for the block that you are working on is my advice for pressing. But typically, yes, I follow the rule of pressing to the dark side. Okay, there is our disappearing churn dash. And I just rotated a couple sections so that they came to the outside. And you can see that this is a wonky block because those points don't match up on that seam. So I don't know. I'd have to look at it across the room and see if that's an instance where your eye will compensate and just assume everything matches up, and only the really nitpicky quilt judge type people will look at that and see that the corners don't match. But who knows? Yeah, I don't know. This seam is really off and that one's really off. You can't really tell from a distance, but I think that would bother me quite a bit. So it's something to do with this half square triangle unit is bigger than these two. So I don't know how to fix it. So again, that may be seeing the results. It may be that I just don't do a disappearing technique with the churn dash block. But I know Pamela is saying she likes it on point. Here's your straight setting, but there's the on point. Yep, because it changes the lines of the quilt. So yeah, that's fun. But it is a fun block. You just have to get those intersections to meet. You would just have to plan your. I'd probably, if I were making a whole quilt with this layout, I would draft the pattern so that you make, you make your row that has a half square triangle and a two patch, or a, somehow you'd have to draft the block differently to make it all come together. And then you could, with these smaller squares, you could strip piece and subcut those as 2 or 3 patches, to put it all together, to make sure that little imperfect jog doesn't happen. And that one's really off. This one you could probably get away with them not meeting exactly. That one doesn't meet exactly, but this one's really off. So that would bother me. So again, live and learn. It was an experiment. But I do have time. I'm just trying to see if I have fabric around to cut and sew, because I wanted to see what a disappearing pinwheel would look like. So remember, our 4-patch gives kind of a woven look when you start with a 4-patch, and a pinwheel is a 4-patch block. So let me quick make some half square triangles and we can try that. I have a basket of half square triangles, but they're all pretty small, actually. I say that, and yeah, because like that one's, those half square triangles were only about 2.5 inches. But let me see if I've got some bigger ones cut. And because I don't want to try this technique with tiny pieces. Okay, so I've got some lights. Do I have some darks that are big? This is the state of your scraps when you have been sewing for 15 years. And these are all like binding cast offs. And yeah, I don't think I have. Ooh. Yes. If you dig deep, you can find what you need. Okay, now this is going to be kind of messy because I don't have my iron on, and I'm dropping things and trying to pick them up and put things away. Okay, so I've got plenty of triangles. So I'm going to piece a quick pinwheel block because I found light and dark triangles that are big enough to make it work. And we're going to see what a disappearing pinwheel might look like. So these are scraps from an old project, and my lighter triangles are smaller than my dark triangles, but I don't care. I'm just lining that light one up in one corner of the bigger one, and I will trim off that excess later. And for half square triangles, you sew on the long edge of your triangle pieces. And you need 4 half square triangles to make a pinwheel. I haven't been keeping up with the chat, so just talk amongst yourselves. Yep, Pamela is with me on the not worrying about quilts falling apart because she's not going to be here in 100 years. Yeah, they serve their purpose. If they last that long, great. And you should label them in case someone many years from now finds it and wants to know who made it. Okay, so I have my triangles, and we were talking about pressing, Pamela. I usually say on half square triangle, I press open, but I don't know how this block is going to come out when I rearrange. So I'm going to press these open. And again, I'm just finger pressing, running my fingernail along the back to lay those open. So there's my seam pressed open. And I can, I thought I could get away with one more seam before I had to trim, but I can't, so I may as well. Press these others and then I can trim, because like I said, I used a smaller light triangle, so I need to trim off that excess. And there may be some scrap quilters that would keep that 1-inch strip. Not me. 1 inch is too small for me to bother saving. So I'm just going to square that up, and these are about 4 inches. Okay, I do take the time, I'm going to in just a second, to trim off those dog ears. Dog ears on half square triangles really bother me, so I just cut those off with my rotary cutter or with a pair of scissors. I tend to do that, if I remember, before I press them open. I find it easier to trim the dog ears at that stage. Okay. So we get to play with, oh no, I have to actually sew the pinwheel. What are you doing, Andy? Okay. So. Oops, didn't get that one. Squared up. What's the problem? When your squares overlap, you know something's wrong, because at this point everything should match. Okay, sewing a pinwheel. Flying fabric. Okay, and again, I'm pressing these 2 seams open, and then we will have our 4-patch pinwheel block, and then we can slice it up and do something new with it. Okay, so as I said, I insert my pin in the middle of the seam on the front, make sure it went through the middle of the seam on the back, and line that up. And then I can sew. And I do spend a lot of time lifting my fabric up and readjusting to make sure that seam stays flat as I sew. Okay, so we have our basic pinwheel, and now, yeah, Pamela, if you're having trouble with your pinwheels, I would definitely pin. I don't, I don't pin the squares at the beginning when I make obviously a 2-patch, but anytime I have an intersection, and that's not perfect, but it's going to work for this effect. Okay, so for our disappearing, if we just cut halfway down each side, then we're going to end up with very symmetrical half square triangles and plain squares. We don't want nice and simple. So I am only going to cut an inch away from that center seam. So I need to make 2 cuts horizontal and 2. This is the vertical way, but obviously we turn. So 2 cuts on the side of both center seams. And you want to go an inch away. You don't want to be right in the middle. This is kind of improv, so you want to be about an inch away. If you want to have a narrow strip in the center, that's fine, but I like to have room on either side of that seam. So I'm going to go an inch away from all my straight seams, not the diagonals of the block. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Since I have a rotating mat, I'm going to do all 4 cuts without moving any fabric. Just rotate my mat and reposition my ruler. Everything stays in place. And here is our, I'm trying to do this without it. So as you can see, we've just cut ourselves some smaller half square triangles, some strips, and then we've got this cute mini pinwheel from the center. And just like with our 4-patch block, it kind of creates a woven effect. And now we have a 9-patch. We've got 9 units to sew together. So I'm going to jumble them up and see what we come up with. Well, we come up with a churn dash is what we could do. Let me my center strips have a funky dog ear from where they were sewn to the pinwheel. So basically I'm laying this out and making sure that I'm just rotating the light and dark sections so that the light and dark fabrics, I was going to say they don't touch, but they do, and I'll show you. So here is our disappearing pinwheel. So you see that dark is going to touch the dark on that pinwheel. And if there's no way to rotate that pinwheel to get that dark not to touch. So that pinwheel's pretty funky. So now I will sew that. And you can see why I thought we'd have a churn dash. Let me get rid of that guy. He's annoying. Because we could just turn that. It's just not quite wide enough when you turn it sideways, but you've got the half square triangle and the bar that makes up the churn dash block. But we are working with our pieces in a little bit different orientation, so it doesn't work out exactly to a churn dash block. Okay, so now we sew our 9-patch. And on these little pieces, I am not worried about pinning because I can hold them in place. And it's not going to matter. And again, some of my pieces are wonky and not lining up, but we'll trim the final block and it'll be fine. So again, our half square triangle units come out a little bit differently than our strip units. And did I sew that on the wrong side? I think I messed something up turning things around. Let me get all my pieces in place and figure out what's the right. Yeah, I turned my square around. So seam ripper. I need to figure out how to change the default stitch length on my machine because right now it's set to 2.0 and I like it for piecing at 2.5, especially if you have to rip. It's easier to rip longer stitches out. Okay. So that needs to go that way. That unit is still interesting. Okay, when I'm working with the rows, I am going to pin. Just because that, since I haven't pressed things, they aren't flat and it's making it difficult to stay lined up. Okay, I just am sewing the last row of my disappearing pinwheel. We started with our pinwheel, which is a 4-patch unit. And then I chopped it up, so now it's a 9-patch unit. So I had 3 rows to sew together, and here is my final row. You can see the half square triangle elements do show up in the disappearing version. And I can't wait to show you this. There's such a cute little pinwheel in the center. So I told you I didn't save those 1-inch strips that I trimmed off when my half square triangles were too big. I will save them to be these leader ender thread tabs. So you can see I just run that under my needle when I finish. And just getting some snips. There is our cute little disappearing pinwheel. Like I said, it makes this cute little pinwheel in the center that gets kind of crazy because things don't line up with the colors exactly right. So, but I think that is a really cool looking block. And you could always, I'm thinking, you could make your disappearing pinwheels and then, but I'm not sure I would keep those center small pinwheels. I might take those out and substitute a solid square and like as a cornerstone and use those little pinwheels somewhere else, but I'm kind of crazy. Anyway, so that is our disappearing pinwheel block. So we have had quite a full morning with the Sketch-tember free motion quilting design that I showed at the very beginning of the broadcast. So if you came in a little bit late, you'll want to replay those first 10 minutes to get your sketch practice in for Sketch-tember. I will be live every day this month. Fingers crossed that life doesn't get too hectic and derail my personal challenge of 30 days of Sketch-tember to give you some free motion quilting ideas. And then we did our disappearing blocks. So disappearing pinwheel. Let me grab the others. Disappearing 4-patch. So you can see kind of the woven look of those blocks are similar because we started with a 4-patch unit, basic 4-patch pinwheel block. And then we did our disappearing 9-patch, which was a lot of fun. And our disappearing churn dash, that is the same basic concept as the disappearing 9-patch because the churn dash and the 9-patch have the same basic construction, But as I mentioned earlier, that gets a little wonky. Not all the seams match. And I think it has to do with the math of a half square triangle versus the squares. So I hope you are inspired and have a little fun mixing and matching your stash. And I am looking at a sampler I have across the room that has a friendship star, which is another 9-patch layout that would be interesting to do as a disappearing block. So, yeah, lots of fun. Quilting is just an infinite inspirational activity. Pam's asking about my daily broadcast. It has to vary, unfortunately, because I've got a crazy work schedule, and sometimes I have meetings in the morning, so the broadcast will be in the afternoon, and sometimes it's flip-flopped where I have a meeting in the afternoon, so I'll hop on quick in the morning. And I apologize. I know that makes it crazy for people that want to tune in, but you can always find the replay if you don't catch it live. Videos on YouTube will last forever until the site goes down. So I hope you have fun, and find me on social media, Facebook and Instagram, True Blue Quilts, and you can share your pictures, tag me in your posts, and I'd love to see your quilts, your sketches, fabrics that you're working with. I love it all. So as I said, these sit and sew chats are live the first Saturday of every month, and I hope to see you back here in October. Have a wonderful day. Have a lovely weekend. If you subscribe to the True Blue Quilts YouTube channel, hit the bell for the notification, and then you will be all set to find me the next time I go live, or shortly thereafter if the notification gets delayed. But it's always nice to see people here live. Thank you for our new friends, new members of the True Blue crew. And if you visit truebluequilts.com, you can sign up for my newsletter, and I have a monthly recap of what has happened. So it's not like you'll be getting emails flooding your inbox, but I'd love to connect over there. How weird, Pamela's saying the bell notification doesn't work. Right? Yeah, it's hit or miss sometimes. YouTube plays with the algorithm, makes it hard to connect here on this platform. But I do appreciate you spending your time with me this morning, and hope that you found a little bit of fabric inspiration. And one of the other things, I'm just reaching across my table here, Island Batik sent me this new package of 10-inch squares, so I may have to chop them up into disappearing blocks. Won't that be fun? So I'm going to take off and get along with the rest of my weekend chores, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Thanks so much.